Hey everyone, welcome to this
Hi.
panel on How Dark is Too Dark. Unfortunately, we've had a few last minute changes as some of the original panelists weren't able to make it. So we're very lucky because Madeline Dyer and Chloe Gilholy have both stepped into the breach. So I think we shall have, and Christina, of course, was one of the original panelists and she's still available, thankfully, to join us. So I think we'll have a very interesting discussion. So I think this is a really interesting topic because it touches on so many themes that are relevant to YA, to mystery and to murder. And because there's quite a wide range of experience in the group, we're going to sort of expand it to talk about how it relates to adult work as well. So first of all, I'd like to ask the panel to introduce themselves. So Madeline, perhaps we'd start with you if that's all right, and introduce your book as well, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone. I'm Madeline Dyer. I write YA thrillers and dystopian. So, my most recent book is The Rhythm of My Soul, which is written under my pen name Ellen Dyer, and this is about competitive ballerinas with dark, deadly secrets and who want revenge. So, it's very much a very dark story. And then my other series is the Untamed series, which is YA dystopian. And in this book, there are a lot of torture scenes. So it seems very appropriate for this panel. So yeah, that's me.
Should I go? I'll step into the breach. I'm Christina Hoag, and I'm a YA and adult writer as well, and somehow sort of managed to bridge both age ranges. This is a total YA. Is Girl on the Brink, published a few years ago, and I came out with a second edition last year. And it's about a 17-year-old girl who gets involved with the wrong guy and has to extricate herself from a dangerous relationship. So this also deals with a dark theme of intimate partner violence, and but very real. And then I have another book also I published a few years ago and got a second edition, new publisher on it last year. And this is started life as a YA, and then it went into sort of an older YA. I upped the age of the character a few things, and also very dark themes of gang violence, which I covered as a reporter here in Los Angeles, where I'm joining you. And my latest one is just a novella, Law of the Jungle, also published by a small press, and it's a fully adult, no YA themes, but it's about a woman in the jungle, a scientist in the jungle, and she meets a ruthless entrepreneur, and all sorts of nefarious things result. And that's me.
That sounds fantastic. There's a great range there as well. Chloe, would you like to tell us about yours?
Well, I'm Chloe Gilholy. I live in Banbury, Oxfordshire, and one of my latest novels is called Game of Mass Destruction. It's about a group of people. They get nominated to play this game show, and their task is to destroy 1,000 robots, but they get more points if they have sex or they kill each other.
Wow, that sounds like it certainly has plenty of dark topics in there. Okay, well, listen, the first question I was hoping we'd all discuss was, is darkness one of the aspects that attracted you initially to mystery and thriller? Maddie, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, I'm sure you know the answer to this as you're one of my critique partners, Mocha. But I love writing darkness, like anything sort of like murder, anything gruesome. I love writing really explicit sort of like violent scenes, like quite graphic. Yeah, like that is really what draws me to the genre. And I've noticed this particularly because my agent suggested that I try writing a middle grade mystery. And I keep wanting to kill off all my characters in it. And I kind of know I can't really do that in middle grade. And it's just, that's kind of almost what I'm programmed to do as a writer, especially if I get stuck in my draft. I just kill off a character. And I think that's kind of fine to do in young adult or adult, but not really middle grade. So yeah, I'm definitely drawn to like these dark elements. And it's those stories that interest me, like not just because I like killing people essentially, but I like sort of the commentary that you can get going on sort of what human nature is, what it's capable of, and the psychology of like violence and crime as well. So yeah, I'm really interested in all of those things.
I think that's a really interesting point as well about middle grade. I'd imagine that the subject matter, you can, I'd imagine there's a much smaller difference between adult and young adult in terms of subject matter for murder mystery anyway, or mystery thriller. But yeah, definitely. I mean, you probably can you even have murder in middle grade, or is it more sort of heist and
yeah? So you can
robberies
have
and things?
murder, but it can't be. You can't kill off one of the children in the story. So if you've got a murder, it's usually a teacher or an adult character who they don't know that well. But yeah, that sort of like limits who can actually be murdered on page. And obviously, like if they are actually murdered on page, you've got to be really careful with the language and the imagery that you use.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense, definitely. Christina, would you like to answer the question? Was darkness one of the things that attracted you to the genre?
Yes, yes, it was. People have said to me, "Why do you write so dark?" And I don't have a good question. It just, that's just what came out when I started writing fiction. And I thought, well, perhaps it's because I was a journalist and I wrote about a lot of dark things. You see a side of life as a journalist that most, sort of people, middle class people don't really see. And so I just sort of attributed it to that maybe. But I'm also, just as Madeline said, I'm interested in the psychology of what, sort of the extreme of the human condition and the depths that we can go to. And are all of us capable of of committing depraved acts, or is it a select few? Does it depend on our upbringing? Is it genetic? All these sort of very basic questions that I think you can kind of explore when you're writing crime fiction. And it does, of course, lead to some very dark places. And my partner's always like rolling his eyes. I'm watching another true crime show on Netflix or something. But there's something about it. It's like, I don't know. It's just like this extreme of human behavior. And I think that's just a really interesting theme to explore.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, in YA particularly, it can be harder to find opportunities to explore the darker aspects of human nature, which I think is why a lot of YA authors are driven or are drawn to mystery and thriller, because it gives you that opportunity. Because generally speaking, YA does tend to be a bit more upbeat, but then you also want to write about an authentic experience of, because being a teenager can be very difficult. So I find mystery thriller definitely gives an opportunity to discuss those sort of aspects that can be a bit more inaccessible in other genres in YA. Chloe,
Yeah,
what about you?
I just want to add in that, in teenage, the adolescent life is also full of angst. There's a lot of angstiness, and you're discovering the world. This is the time when you sort of bump up against reality. Middle grade and lower, you're sort of protected and sort of your family cocoon, school. But YA, as a teenager, you get beyond that, and that's your first introduction to the world, which often isn't the nice things. And you discover that life isn't fair, and shit does happen and things like that. So I think it's also a very angst-ridden time of life that sort of leads into these sort of darker themes.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, that's a great description actually of being a young adult or being a teen, and it's very much that aspect of it that draws me to it. I must remember that when people ask me, so why do you write YA again? I must just repeat what you said. It's perfect. Chloe, what's your answer to the question?
Yeah, and I think with YA, it's quite broad. You can sort of slip into the adult territory, and then you can slip back to the young genre. I think what got me into writing dark fiction was that I read this book called Battle Royale. I think I was still 14, 15 at the time, and it was different. I'd never read anything like it before, but it just sort of like changed my life. And then just like seeing all these kids, they've got all their anxieties, and then on top of that, they're put in this program where they've got to kill each other off. And now it's
So
like
that
more of a
was,
horror story than anything now.
it sounds, yeah. So that was your inspiration. That
Yeah,
was a big
definitely.
inspiration to you in writing in general, was it, Chloe?
Yeah, definitely. Because
Oh,
I
that's amazing.
remember when I was little, I was in the library, and I think I was about 6 at the time, I tried to borrow Carrie and Pride and Prejudice, and the librarian stopped me and said, "Oh, I think they're a bit too much for you."
You're a very ambitious 6-year-old reader. I'm super impressed. Let's move on to the next question. What do you feel are good ways, like these are kind of more craft tips, what's a good way to kind of invest your writing with a dark mood or a sense of darkness? Like, for example, through setting, etc. Christina, would you like to start with this one? How do you invest your writing with a dark mood?
Yeah, I think setting is a big one. Night, have things happen at night. That automatically makes it a little more sinister, and especially if you have your characters doing things they're not supposed to be doing, whether it's something very sort of teenage, drinking, or, they're smoking or something, and then something happens, at night or something. Setting, the current mystery I'm working on is set a lot of it in the woods, where the crimes actually happen in woods, and I made that a very sinister setting. And you can also, and just use of language, obviously, using that sort of sinister language to set the mood. But I'd say setting and is a key way of getting that mood across.
I totally agree. And a setting like a woodland can easily be made so spooky. You can have sort of the happy woodland to picnic in, and then you can change it very quickly by, a breeze that sort of gets stronger or whatever. And yeah, they're great ways to kind of introduce an element of suspense. Maddie, what about you? How do you like to introduce?
Yeah, so I'm a massive fan of like imagery and like really sort of like specific, intricate imagery that heightens mood and tone and atmosphere. I mean, I agree with Christina entirely with everything that she said as well. So like setting is so important. And when I am including like something that's like dark, really dark content, I always make sure that I'm giving it the time for it to fully develop in the novel and to give it sort of the space that it needs. So you're not just sort of like putting it in just as a plot twist, but you're incorporating it fully into the story, and you're showing the impact that it has, not just on the main character, but all the other characters around. And yeah, because sometimes it can feel like dark content is almost just shoehorned in, or that you're just including too much dark content of different types. So I think it's just really important, especially when it's fiction for young adults, just to give it like breathing space, make sure that you're doing it justice, and that you're also taking it seriously, and like pretty much just taking the premise that you're writing about with the darkness seriously and giving it sort of an authentic realism.
That's such a good point about giving, because I think when one is writing description, either you tend to write too much or you don't tend to write enough, and trying to find that balance between having enough to kind of create the atmosphere and keep the reader intrigued without making it too long, is one of the key secrets that one needs to master, I guess, as a writer. But I think that's a really good way of putting it, giving it enough space to build and enough space for the atmosphere to permeate and the reader to really get absorbed into it. I also like taking quite a sort of a scene that looks sort of superficially kind of happy or innocent or whatever, and just adding a little edge of menace to it that sort of makes the reader pause a little bit. And I love reading that as well. Everything's fine, but there's just this edge lingering under it, and it's not going to last. Something's going to happen. What about you, Chloe? How do you like to incorporate mood and suspense and mystery atmosphere into your writing?
Yeah, I think I leave a lot of it down to my characters a lot, especially because in Game of Mass Destruction, my main antagonist is very theatrical and grand. 1 minute she can be all bubbly and happy, and the next minute she can just click like that and do something horrible. And I think it's the unstableness of her that sort of throws everything off. Like, what could be a nice and beautiful island could turn into darkness because just by one person.
That's a great point. Yeah, that is a great point, and how you can flip the switch very easily. The next question I wanted to ask is there anything in terms of content, is there anything you feel is too dark, or is there anything you avoid as too dark? We sort of touched on this a little bit when we were talking about content for middle grade as compared to content for YA, as compared to content for adults. And I think it might be interesting to expand on that a little bit. Like, what do you think would be too dark for YA that might be perfectly acceptable in an adult novel? Who'd like to go first with that? Maddie, would you go first with that?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm of the belief that there's nothing that's really too dark for YA, so long as it's tackled in an appropriate and sort of like a specific way that works for that novel. Because pretty much all the dark topics that you're going to get in adult fiction, teenagers are also going to be exposed to them in some capacity. And so I recently read a really good YA novel about human trafficking, and it was marketed as YA. And I was looking at reviews, and lots of people were saying, oh, this is too dark for YA. It should be reserved just for an adult novel. But the thing is, when you actually look at the statistics for the type of people that are vulnerable for human trafficking, it is young teenagers. And if teenagers have already read a novel, such as this one that I had just read, and they can see the signs and they know what signs to look out for, and then if they are actually approached by a human trafficker, they're going to be equipped with this knowledge that, oh, this could be about to happen. So I think if teenagers are reading about these dark topics that some people might not actually think are appropriate, it does equip teenagers and young adults with these skills to recognize potentially dangerous situations. So I think it's really, really important, and that you shouldn't sort of censor what teenagers will be reading, because if they're finding something is too dark, likelihood is that they're just going to stop reading anyway. I mean, a romance reader who's a teenager probably isn't going to gravitate towards the really dark books anyway, because it's all sort of personal preference. So I don't really think we should be saying anything is too dark.
Well, it is a good point, definitely. And, you know, that one of the great things about fiction is that it can help prepare you for things that happen in real life, or, you know, in that case, give a warning, or in other cases, it can show that, you know, you're not the only person this happened to, or whatever. So, yeah, I do agree with. Have you come up, though, like, say, talking to agents or publishers, have you come up against any pushback in terms of what they might consider too dark?
I haven't specifically. Like, my agent also really likes dark stories, which really helps because we're on very much the same page with what we write. Because I'm really into thrillers and horror, so obviously they just have a lot of dark topics anyway. And my agent specifically looks out for those stories. Recently, I have noticed with sort of the publishing industry, there is sort of more scope towards having these darker stories, and more editors do seem to be open towards acquiring these stories as well.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I've seen quite a lot about no dead animals. I wonder how far that extends. Presumably it won't include no dead people, because that would kill mystery. That would kill mystery genre completely.
Yeah, I see that a lot too in you know, submitting short stories to literary journals and things. It says no, you know, dead animal, you know, cruelty to animals and things. And I thought, okay, cruelty to humans is acceptable, not to animals. But yeah, that's a common sort of thing. But I agree. I don't think anything's really too dark of a theme for YA. I think that's sort of as I said, I think teenagers want that. They want to be exposed to that side. You know, they're sort of have a weirdly sort of nihilistic view of the world, you know, dystopian type of thing. So I think that kind of appeals. But again, if you're not into that, you're not going to pick up a dark book anyway. I have had people say to me, Girl on the Brink, you know, I stopped reading it, or gee, it was difficult to read at points, because I do have some mild physical abuse in there. He pushes her out the door of a caravan where he lives and that kind of thing, but it's not like full on, you know, beating up or what have you. And I am mindful of that. I don't, you know, go too dark, because it can turn off readers as well as myself. You know, you don't, you know, I picked up a true crime nonfiction book the other day, and I couldn't read it because it was just too dark. You know? and of course this was true crime, it wasn't fiction, but you know, there is such a thing, you know, you just don't want to read, you know, I won't even go into it, but you know, really gory things, you know, people doing to other people. Maybe it was a monster or a, you know, a fantasy sort of figure. it's easier to stomach. But yeah, so I do avoid excessive gory stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. A lot of it is in the way you write about it. And I think probably when you're writing in young adults, you do have to be, you have to be reasonably sensitive that, well, maybe actually it's more, I don't know, well, reasonably sensitive about the gore, but maybe not so much. But certainly, if you're dealing with sexuality or anything, that needs to be, like what you were saying about the case of the abusive boyfriend. I'm sure you probably had to be quite careful there in the way you represented that.
Yeah, as I said, I didn't, make it a full-on thing, but I did put some physical abuse and the emotional abuse described, and people did say it was difficult to read. I did get some reports back, but they still loved it. People who still like, yeah, I had to put it down, then they came back to it. So, and I'm sure there were some people who put it down and didn't go back to it.
Well, again, like Maddie was saying, like it's an important topic. It is
Mm-hmm.
an important topic, and it's important to write about it. Chloe, what about you? What's your take on this? Is there anything you think is too dark?
No, not really, because I did read quite a lot of dark YA as a teenager, and I think that helped me understand some of the toxic traits in people. Like, it helped me escape some pretty bad situations and red flags when it came to dating. So I found it quite useful.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, no, that is really good. So there's another question I was wondering about. There is a bit of an overlap. Well, there can be an overlap definitely between horror and suspense, thriller, etc. Have any of you ever been tempted to add a speculative element to your mysteries? And if so, how did that work out? Maddie, you're nodding there. Would you like to start?
So that actually fits in perfectly with my current manuscript that I'm working on. So I won't say too much about it because I always feel like if I tell someone about it when I'm writing it, I then feel like I've already written it and I'm just sort of like losing motivation. But yeah, I'm writing horror at the moment and it is a speculative horror. And just having sort of a speculative fiction element, it's allowing me much more flexibility. And I found I'm gravitating more towards the Gothic as well. So it's introducing this whole new tone, and I think it makes it much more creepy. And then because I realised that I'm sort of leaning more towards Gothic, speculative, it's changed the setting that I had set it in. So I'm now using pretty much a standard sort of Gothic setting as well, just to make it creepier. And I'm just really loving it. And sort of like the speculative element just adds a whole new dimension to it. And also the world building, because I can like break the normal rules of the world now, because like I'm kind of in charge of this world building and I can sort of like shape it exactly how I need it in order to do exactly as I want it to do with the characters. It's really hard talking about it without being like giving any specifics away, but yeah, I really love speculative fiction, particularly when it's like merging with sort of like what you think is contemporary. So if a novel starts off and you think it's like contemporary thriller, but then you've got like the gradual building of a speculative element or like ghosts in it, like I love that so much.
That sounds fascinating. And yeah, I saw the panel, the Gothic panel, and it was brilliant. I was kind of hoping Dana would be here today because I saw her interview with you, and she said that her current one sounds like it is speculative. Definitely sounds like it is speculative elements too. And she's written so much YA mystery. I was interested to hear, what she'd say about the change as well. Tell us, Christina, have you ever used speculative elements, or is that something?
Not really. I think actually, just to comment on the Gothic, I think that's really in right now. There seems to be a resurgence of Gothic anyway. There's been a few hit books with Gothic elements, so I think Maddie, you're on the right path there. Yeah, I tend not to do the speculative stuff. I'm not into that. I never really was. Like Chloe, I actually read a lot of dark fiction when I was a teenager. I love dark stuff, and so I suppose we all do write what we like to read. And yeah, I've never been into that. I read Stephen King, of course. And then after a while, grew tired of him as a teenager. And so I tend to not to go into that stuff. I tend to be very reality based. And again, maybe it's because of my journalist background. I was always writing about very real things. That may be something about that too. But yeah, I haven't gone down that road.
No, I think also with readers as well. Like, I mean, there are people who read fantasy and non-fantasy, but often there is quite a strong line. Like, there are people who just won't read fantasy because it's just not their thing. My mom was like that. I never got any fantasy growing up, and then as a teenager, I devoured it everywhere I could get it because I thought it was great, but it'd never been on her list of necessary reading for her daughter. But Chloe, tell us about you. Do you use speculative elements in your writing?
I think I do subconsciously, but in the game of mass destruction, Japan sort of has a society that has robots living in them where people can get married to robots. But I haven't really explored that very much in the novels because I thought, oh, maybe I could save that for another book. But I think I do it quite a bit, maybe subconsciously. But a lot of my work, my fiction work's quite contemporary. But I think I do it without realising.
That's interesting. It's something you might want to explore a bit more later on. We've been talking a lot about adding dark elements to our stories. So how do you all feel about adding a little bit of humour to add a lighter touch to balance the darkness? Or do you have any little tricks that you like to use to just sort of, change the mood up a little bit from time to time? Christina, would you like to answer that first?
Yeah, I mean, I think your readers do need relief, and a lot of it is about balancing your scenes. If you have a dark scene, then just have a bit of a lighter scene and that kind of thing. In this book, which deals with gang violence and a guy trying to get out of the gang, and he gets pulled back in, kind of thing, and ends up at work, in a whole big murder and whatnot. I had a character, one of the gang members, Tweety. He's sort of, not too bright, so he says these funny things all the time, and he provides a little bit of comic relief, and even to his other homies in the gang, they all roll their eyes and they laugh at what Tweety says. So that was a way of kind of lightening up a little bit the dark material. That's what I did with that one.
I think that's a brilliant idea. Having one character who's kind of a bit like the clown of the group, or just adds that lighter element, and then you can introduce them whenever you need to. It's a really good way to do it. It sounds fabulous. Maddie, what about you? What do you do to introduce a lighter tone?
Christina, when you were saying how you do it in your books, I was just thinking what I have in my book. So in this one, basically it's YA dystopian. I've got a group of people that are constantly on the run, being hunted down. And it's the romance that's building between two of the characters in this group on the run that sort of provides the lighter moments, the moments where they can sort of show vulnerability and just have a bit of relief from being on the run and being hunted down and injured all the time. But I also have this ongoing storyline. It's not really sort of a full storyline in this book, but basically the main character really wants some mouthwash because she's on the run. She hasn't got any supplies with her. And every raid that they do on a town or a city, she's hoping that someone picks up mouthwash for her. And every time someone from her group comes back from a raid, she's like, have you got mouthwash? And they'll be like, no. But then at the end, she finally gets her mouthwash. So yeah, that was kind of how I just added in some lighter relief. And then in my other sort of dark book, this book has a lot of dark topics. So you've got mental illness, eating disorder. There's a lot of grief, death in this book, and revenge, violence, sort of acephobia as well. But there are lighter moments in this book, which are through the dance. They're all ballerinas, professional ballerinas in this book. So they're connecting with themselves and with each other through dance. And you can see these relationships forming and them getting sort of the positions that they want in the companies. So yeah, I mean, I don't really use humor that much in my book just because I'm not a very funny writer in general. I really struggle with writing humor. But when I've been working on my middle grade mystery, I've been reading so many middle grades, and I'm noticing that whenever they have anything really dark, it's followed by a humorous moment. Even if that moment is completely different and about something unrelated or with different characters, there's pretty much always that structure where a dark thing then is immediately followed by something that has a slightly humorous angle, often with a different subplot, different narrating characters. So yeah, I've been really mindful of that when I've been working on my middle grade, just sort of like trying to get this balance right. And I think in middle grade, you do need more humor than you might need in YA, whereas sort of the lighter moments in YA are sort of like more for relief, where you're focusing on a different element. But yeah, humor seems much more prevalent in the middle grade that I'm reading.
Yeah, I'd say you could be right about that, about humor in middle grade. I don't think I'm particularly funny either, but sometimes I get feedback saying they found something I said funny, or often actually it's people from the US, because I use a very Irish turn of phrase and they just find that funny. So sometimes it can just be your voice. Like, you don't have to really be funny. It's just the way you express things, or, you know, and I think probably the secret is not to try too hard as well, because often if you really try to be funny, it's not going to work. But I don't know. Chloe, what about you? How do you add, do you have any ways of adding lighter touches to alleviate the darkness?
Yeah, I think some of my humour is a bit unintentional, because there's like one scene where one of the characters gets killed off and the robots are eating them, and then one of the robots says, "Oh, this is nice with some custard." I think at the time I thought, "I'll add a bit of random, it'll make people laugh." And now I'm looking back and thinking, the readers are going to think, why are the robots so obsessed with custard?
Well, either of those could be funny. You know, I mean, yeah, either of those reactions, I think a reader would be amused by, would find amusing. So that's, you know, that's good, isn't it? The next question I have is kind of, if anyone has an opinion about what is this, I suppose is more to do with gatekeeping, but what would be, is there a difference between what would be considered too dark in traditional publishing and in self-publishing? Maddie, would you like to go with that? Because I know you've a wide range of experience.
Yeah, so I have done both traditional and self-publishing, and I would say if you'd asked me this and we were looking at 5 years ago, there would have been quite a big difference, where like the traditional publishers might not have thought that these darker stories are as commercial. So you might have had to have self-published if you had these darker stories. But I think at the moment, the publishing industry is looking for more dark stories, because I mean, they are selling well. Like, we can see that with, if you just look at the top YA bestsellers at the moment, a lot of them do have this dark content. And you're getting sort of like these novels that are becoming instant New York Times bestsellers, and they do have dark content in, and like readers are looking for that. So I think at the moment, there's not really that much difference between how much darkness is appropriate for traditional publishing or self-publishing. Yeah.
That sounds, yeah, no, I agree, actually. I'm wondering what's the trend, but we'll discuss that afterwards, because that's actually an extra question that's just occurred to me. Christina, have you anything to add on that, or have you experienced?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say. I don't have any personal experience with that, but obviously with self-publishing, you can write what you want, you know, so you can do things that you don't have to worry about really are going to pass the gatekeeping process, you know, along the way. So maybe you can have more latitude in writing that. But I mean, again, you have to market it in the end and get people to read it. So I'm not sure you win by that or not. I don't know. Know really enough about that. It's a good question.
Yeah, I know, it's something that occurred to me that might be of interest. Chloe, have you had experience in the self-publishing world, and can you comment on this?
Yeah, I think most of my stuff's all been self-published, and I think the trends always change all the time. Like, 1 minute there'll be a lot of YA thrillers, and then a couple of years ago it was loads of erotica when 50 Shades of Grey got popular, and I think the trends just keep changing and changing all the time. So I think it depends on what the trends are and what the publishers want. But I like self-publishing because I think you can sort of have your own control on it. But if I was offered traditional publishing, I would still take it for the experience.
Yeah, of course, that's a good point. Yeah, so the other question actually that just occurred to me when Madeleine was talking was about how darker darker stories seem to be more popular at the moment. I was wondering if anyone has any insight into that. I mean, is it, I mean, presumably it probably is connected to the last few years we've all had around the world. So, Christina, would you like to just answer that and tell us what you think about why dark stories are popular at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a sign of the times. I think we live in a very unsettled time, and it sort of just reflects back the mood that everyone's in. You know, there's just odd things going on. You know, politically, we've got a war, an invasion, a war sparked by an invasion, which we haven't seen for many decades. You know, a pandemic, which was only the stuff of dystopian science fiction. You know, and it all came true. And just people are feeling very unsettled. So I think you have to, you know, look at, and I think it's just a reflection of the times and people seeing that maybe there's a way through the darkness. You know, I think fiction, you know, usually ends on some sort of resolution. You know, there's a resolution, or people are looking to darker fiction for a way through, perhaps.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And Maddie, would you, I was wondering as well, like, you know, and Christina touched on it, the sort of resurgence and popularity of Gothic fiction. Do you think that's all connected to this?
Yeah, I do, because I often, like, I know with myself, like, if I'm going through something difficult, I want to read a book where the characters are going through something even more difficult, just because it kind of makes me feel a bit better about my own situation. And it's weird when I say I read for escapism, but I read dark stories for escapism, because that's just sort of like what I'm really interested in. So yeah, I definitely agree with Christina that I think that the sort of current popularity and success of all these dark stories is a sign of the times. Because I mean, there is also, it's not just that there's just dark stories that are popular. We've got a surge of romance being really popular now as well, and sort of like rom-coms in particular. So it does balance out, and I think it shows that people are often looking for even darker stories than what you're currently experiencing, or they're looking for complete escapism and going the opposite way. So I am noticing that there's more of a divide, particularly in the bestsellers at the moment, where they're either lighter stories or they're much darker stories. There's not really sort of any in-between ground at the moment. But yeah, Gothic fiction is definitely making a comeback, which makes me so happy.
Yeah, I was wondering with Gothic fiction, it might be connected to the fact that it has that speculative element. So it's dark, but it's removed from reality. I was thinking maybe people like that, you know, the fact that you can read a dark thing, but it's not too realistic. So it does give you that escapism.
Sorry, I've heard also that publishers at the moment, when they're acquiring, they're more interested in speculative fiction than dark contemporary as well at the moment, because those are books are going to be out in like 2 to 3 years' time. So I found that quite interesting as well. Just maybe like they need that extra sort of step away from the real world.
That is interesting. Yeah, absolutely. What do you think, Chloe? Do you think it's a reflection of our current society?
Yeah, I think the pandemic and everything going on with Ukraine sort of affected it, and I think there's a lot of shows like Squid Game and All of Us Are Dead. They were two of the most watched things on Netflix, and Stranger Things. And I also think a lot of us are trying to go back to the 80s and 90s, and Kate Bush being back to #1, and Top Gun being back popular in the cinema. And there was a lot, I think, was it the Cold War in the 80s?
Yeah, the Cold War was in the 80s, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's making a lot of people feel like we're going backwards instead of going forwards.
Those are all great points, and that's something else I've seen going around a lot lately, is the whole idea of nostalgia being very popular, with Stranger Things and Kate Bush being posted as prime examples of that. Do any of you write works that are set a little bit in the past or not? I'm interested because my mystery series, Kit and Tully, starts in the 90s, and it does have a lot of those nostalgia aspects in it. Maddie, have you written anything set? Most of yours tends to be contemporary or dystopian, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I have, but I've written prehistoric settings, so I think that's a bit farther back in time than what you're intending here.
It is, yeah. I don't know if we're all
yeah.
nostalgic for prehistoric times.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I love reading stories set in like 80s and 90s, but I just don't feel confident enough as a writer to set my own work there. So I'm much more into like contemporary. Also prehistory, because I studied that as well. So I'm like massive fan of like the Neolithic and Mesolithic eras. And I also like the Victorian era. So I have got this sort of like idea brewing for like this Victorian setting for a thriller. But yeah, I know that I'd need to do so much research in order to get that right. And I hate doing research. Like
I can
it's just
totally
like
see you doing a steampunk thriller though.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I would just struggle saying something like more historical, to be honest. So I just sort of tend to write what's easier for me. Seems like a bit of a cop-out answer.
No, I think you're right. You should write what you're comfortable with. Christina, what about you? Have you?
I could totally see Maddie doing steampunk, actually, now that you mention it. But yeah, I haven't done that, and I am a bit shy. I actually love research and I love history, so I have thought about it quite a bit, but I just haven't made the leap yet. So it does require a lot of research, and you want to get it right, you know. But I do want to write something about the settlement of Australia and New Zealand in the 19th century. And the only thing I've written actually set in a different time was a short story I put in the 70s. And I put it up on some website or what have you for critique. And somebody seemed really bothered by that. Why are you mentioning, that people are smoking inside the arcade? There was a pinball and 8-track cassette tapes and thing. Do you have to mention that? I'm like, well, I'm thinking, why is this like, they seem bothered by it. It was just an odd thing. But I mean, I mentioned it to anchor the story in the 70s when those things were around. But it was an odd thing, but maybe that put me off or something. But that's the only thing that I've written in another time period.
I actually think that's a really interesting point, because when was my story set in the 90s, I discovered that, yeah, there are certain things there are certain things you can mention, and there are certain things you just aren't interested in. It just sounds boring. So, and
right,
trying to figure out which one.
Yeah, are you trying too hard?
For the YA audience, because they're a contemporary audience. So trying to figure out, but it's hard to know, you see, which it's going to be. So trying to figure out, like, is this one they'll like, or is this one they'll hate? I found things the millennials remember work really well. Like I had a video store in it, and I got loads of like, oh, Blockbusters, used to love Blockbusters. I remember going to Blockbusters. Yeah. So you honestly don't know what it's going to, which ones are going to hit. And then other things like, didn't work at all, and I took them out.
Yeah, you have to start, is it too on the nose? Are you trying too hard to put, these references in that it disturbs the story, but you need some of it, to delineate the period you're in and obviously make it realistic. So that is a fine line.
Yeah, we had a panel a few days ago where we were talking about research. I think it was Jane Jesmond who was the one who was saying that when she does her research to try and work out what things would be like, she ends up putting a lot of the research into the manuscript, but then when she goes through editing, she tries to take out at least half of it, because otherwise she feels like she's just trying too hard to like show that she's done the research. So yeah, I found that really interesting. So I agree with what you were saying there, Christina, as well.
Yeah, it just is, to strike that balance. Again, it's another thing as an author you have to keep in mind, so when writing historical fiction.
What about you, Chloe? Have you included anything from another period in your work?
Yeah, well, Game of Mass Destruction set in the future, and I think a lot of people imagine the future will all be electronic, and that. In my head, I've got imagining people are checking in and out with their thumbprints and watches, and there's some of it you can do now, some of it, but I do think they might go backwards on some of it with climate change, and so I think my version of the future is going to be very different to someone else's idea of the future.
Yeah, good point. And I see we have some questions from the listeners. It's great we have some listeners, given that it's Sunday afternoon and everybody is busy. So I'm delighted a few people are watching it live. The first question is from Wicked Genter and it's, hiya, in my opinion, the YA category has been filled with books from what used to be the sci-fi fantasy romance because of the prominent placement of YA sections in bookstores. So, who'd like to take this question? Maddie, you're pretty good on these genres, so maybe you step in there.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is to do with how bookstores market books, because where a book is placed in the store isn't really up to the author, and it's often to do with what the booksellers think is going to be sort of the most commercial success for how they arrange it. Obviously, the YA category recently in bookshops, it has grown substantially because we're getting a lot more young adult books. One thing that I do notice among readers is they kind of often think young adult is a genre that's equivalent to sci-fi or fantasy. But as young adult is a readership, you can get young adult sci-fi, young adult fantasy, young adult romance, just as you get adult sci-fi, adult romance. So it could just be now that the bookstores are actually separating these books more specifically by readership rather than just any science fiction or fantasy goes into the SFF category, whether it's young adult or adult, but just might not have been that sort of division before. But I mean, yeah, young adult, the whole like industry for young adult publishing has got so much bigger in the last 5 years as well. So it doesn't surprise me when I go into a shop now and just see so many more young adult books, which is just wonderful.
Yeah, it's true. It has. It's got much. I think you've noticed it more in the States though than in some of the European countries, probably. Because I believe like the YA in the States are absolutely enormous in bookshops. Christina, have you anything to say on that question about categorizing?
First of all, there are hardly any bookshops around anymore. At least where I live in Los Angeles, they've all closed. It's horrible. But yeah, I just think it's a question of placement and what sells, and YA does encompass a big chunk of that, those genres. So that's what gets placed in the front of the shops and things. Yeah, I don't know.
I wonder if the questioner sort of means that maybe writers are writing like where they might have written science fiction before for adults, they're writing it more with a YA protagonist now because they think they'll have a better chance of it being published. Would you say there's any truth in that?
That could be. I think so, because there's just been some huge hits, bestsellers with the sci-fi fantasy realm, that maybe there are more YA writers writing that these days, or it has YA themes. I don't, that could be.
I actually think the opposite, because I think, like particularly in the UK, there does seem to be much more sort of like looking at thrillers and crime. There's so much more adult books than young adult books, especially published in the UK. So yeah, I don't know if that's just sort of like difference between the UK and the US, but yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's something I was thinking about just the other day. Actually, I think it was because I've been watching so many panels on the YA Thriller Con. But like thriller mystery is massive in adult fiction. It's a huge, huge, huge genre. I mean, I don't feel it's as big as it's that big in YA. I mean, obviously there are some very popular mystery thrillers, like One of Us is Lying, that really do break out. But overall, I don't know if it's that hugely popular. What do you guys think? Maddie, what do you think?
Yeah, like obviously it is very popular, but I think often like One of Us is Lying, it's a great thriller, but often it's just marketed as a young adult book. So I think that sort of like could be limiting how many adult readers actually pick it up and enjoy it just for like a thriller. Because often these age categories for like the audiences, it can sort of limit who has access to a book. Because I've spoken to some readers who are adults and they're like, oh, I wouldn't touch a young adult book. It's written for children. I am not a child. And it's just like, why? So I do actually wonder sometimes if that also affects the placement of a book in a store. Because I've seen some young adult thrillers that have just been put in the adult section as well. And it's obviously made it look as if there's more adult thrillers than young adult. But I wonder if it's just because these shops are just trying to reach the adult readers as well, who might be too embarrassed to perhaps go and pick something from the young adult bookshelf.
Yeah, that's a good point. Oh,
Yeah, I think it's a really growing. I think it's still growing. I mean, YA was very for many years traditionally sort of romance, and then it's branched off into the other genres. And I still think mystery thriller is probably a smaller one, but I think it's growing.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
really.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. All right, Chloe, do you have anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, I read one. I read a book called Dead Lucky, which was about an influencer that got murdered, and I found that in the adult section of my library, which I thought was interesting because I did get a lot of YA vibes with it, but I guess some people see things differently because I think we've only got.
Sorry, is that by Andrea Cordani, that book?
Yeah.
Yeah. That one, I have seen it shelved as YA. So yeah, that's really interesting because I thought it was the same book that you were talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just about to ask the same thing because Andrea was on the first panel of the conference, wasn't she? Yeah.
Oh, was she?
Yeah, you should check it
Small
out.
world, isn't it?
Because she's some good things to say. And I think she's on quite a few of the panels, so there's plenty to check out if you'd like to see more of her.
Yeah, it's quite a few.
Okay, so the next question we have is also from Wicked at Counter, and they're wondering, should books have a rating system, e.g. PG-13? So I'm sure there'll be some interesting answers on that one.
I think a lot
Christina,
of
would you
mine
like
will
to go
be
first on
18
that?
plus.
Sorry, who did you invite to go first?
Sorry, Christina, would you like to go on that one?
It sounds like it might be a good idea, but I would hate to see readership sort of limited to, I think it would help adults when they're buying books for, they might prefer that, buying books for kids more than the books themselves than kids, because we want to read, and I think also, youngsters read up, so if you're 13, you want to read about 15-year-olds. If you're 17, you're going to want to read about, 18, 19-year-olds. So I don't know if it would be that helpful. And I just hate to see readership limited by categories like that, age or content or what have you. You can get a good idea by reading the blurb on the back or the jacket, what the content is. So I don't think it's really necessary, but it's an interesting idea.
What do you think, Maddie?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Christina. I think if there's going to be something dark in the book, then the jacket descriptions should indicate that so that there aren't any surprises. I have seen some content warnings printed on the jackets as well, which can be really helpful if you're a reader who needs to avoid a certain specific content within a book. That can be really helpful. But yeah, I also think that whether something's marketed like as young adult, as middle grade, or as adult is kind of a rating system within itself. I would hate to see like a rigid rating systems. Like I remember when I was at school and every single book in the school library had a sticker on saying which year group it was appropriate for. And I was in year 7, I'd read all the books for year 7. I just found them like quite boring because they were giving us main characters that were the same age of us. And like Christina's totally right. We want to read up as children and as teenagers. And I remember in year 7, I sneakily borrowed a book for a year 9 student, and it was exactly what I wanted to be reading. It was like everything that I wanted in a book. But when I returned the book to the library and like I scanned in, and the librarian, he was really scary as well, which didn't help. He said, "Oh, you year 9," and like he could see on the computer because it's had like the student ID come up and it showed that I was in year 7, and I got in so much trouble for reading a book that was too old for me. And he like went really mad at me. And like my dad is a writer as well. My mum's a teacher. So my parents were not very happy that like the school was censoring the readership like that in terms of what I could read. And they actually like wrote to the school and like got permission for me to read like the books for the older year groups, because like they just thought it was ridiculous. And like my mum was like, well, if the school's not going to let her read the books, we're going to have to buy it, and we need the school to do it because it will be cheaper to get them like from the library. But yeah, so I would hate to see sort of like a rating system like that, because it would just like act as censorship and gatekeeping, and I don't think it would be helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's like Chloe was saying earlier about when she was 6, although maybe 6 is a little bit young for Carrie. But But it's true, we do all want to read older. And I mean, it's why protagonists in YA are usually at least 16 or older, because, you know, agents and publishers are absolutely convinced that, you know, no 14 or 15-year-old is going to want to read about, or 13-year-old is going to want to read about 14 or 15-year-olds. You have to make them that bit older. That makes them, you know, a bit more glamorous, a bit more exciting, a bit more what you're aspiring to yourself at that age. And yeah, no, and also the problem with bringing in things like PG-13 is like, where do you draw the lines then? You know, it starts entering content, and then, you know, even the whole thing that, you know, Maddie was saying, it is useful getting trigger warnings on books, but then, like, how many trigger warnings do you need? You know, like, because it can start escalating. You know, you could end up needing, you know, trigger warnings for language, trigger warnings for content, trigger warnings for sexual content, trigger warnings for violence. You know, it can. And then it's like, well, where do you stop? So,
I think my
Chloe,
trigger
would you like to
warnings
weigh
would,
in on this and say what you
yeah,
think?
I think some of the trigger warnings would be longer than actual game of mass destruction. Yeah, I think it probably would be, in some ways, I think it would limit access having the age rating, because I think it sort of has that one size fits all, but that's not really true, because and I think a lot of younger people, they're curious and they want to read about people that are older. And I think it's, especially when I was a teenager, I noticed a lot of like the 18 plus books in the bookshops were all covered in that plastic. And that only just made me more curious to read it.
Yeah, that's such a good point as well. If you start putting if you start putting ages on them, then of course people want the ages they're not supposed to have. It's sort of human nature, isn't it? Oh, what's in there? Why am I not allowed to read that? That sounds really interesting, intriguing, juicy. Yeah, can't wait to be 18 and be able to check it out.
Definitely.
But then, of course, it's probably quite disappointing by the time you're 18. But at 14, it seems incredibly tantalizing.
Mm-hmm.
So that pretty much wraps up all the questions that we have for the moment. Thanks a million to the panel for joining in. I think we had a really good discussion. Thanks so much to Maddie for organising this event, which has been amazing. If anyone's watching and hasn't had a chance yet, there's a ton of really great panels with a huge range of interesting material. Like, I think this year the conference has expanded beyond just young adult and thriller mystery. There are panels on Gothic fiction, on fantasy. Maddie, you can probably weigh in with some.
Yeah, we've got Gothic, fantasy, middle grade, and adult. So, like, the middle grade is pretty much just a general writing for middle grade audiences, rather than sort of middle grade and genre specific. And then for adult, we've like got that specific for adult crime. So yeah, we are branching out, and then we have got two panels as well that are just sort of like general writing advice. We've got one about how you plot novels, whether you discovery write, and then we've got another one coming up in a couple of hours actually, which is about the weirdest things that writers have to deal with as well. So that'll be a fun one.
Yeah, that one sounds great.
So
yeah, and there was a brilliant one on diversity as well. I think it was yesterday, and that was fantastic. So listen, before we say goodbye, would everyone like to just say the best place for people to find you? Maddie.
Yeah, sure. So my website is madelinedyer.co.uk, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram as mdyerauthor.
Christina?
Yeah, I'm ChristinaHoag.com. You can look at my books, sign up for my very infrequent newsletter, and find me. I'm on Instagram, Christina Hoag Author, Facebook and Twitter, as well as Pinterest, LinkedIn. I'm on them all. TikTok, what have you. But so yeah, just feel free.
Great. And Chloe, what about you?
Yeah, I write on Vocal Medium occasionally. I've got work on Amazon and Lulu and other sites, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Wattpad as Chloe Boshoka.
Very good. And if anyone's trying to find me, I'm at mochavonb.com, and I'm on social media, but mostly Instagram at mochavonb. Thanks so much to everyone again for joining us. I think we had a really good discussion, even though it was disappointing that several people weren't able to come at the last minute. But I think thanks so much to Maddie and Chloe for stepping in. And I think they did an amazing job. Thanks, guys.
Oh, thank
And
you.
thank you, Mocha, for